So, Lara, as I was reading the new book and revisiting psychoanalysis under occupation, I noticed that there's an intertext, I guess you could call it, which is also a book that I love and a book that I have taught to philosophy students. That is Sarah Ahmed's Willful Subjects. And the figure of the willful subject, and, is the way that Ahmed works it and reworks it. And there's like this arm that reaches, and will is different from willfulness. And I thought today we could, because we're going to be talking about militancy, we're going to be talking about, the need to be able to ward off psychic intrusion. We're going to be talking about a lot of hard things. There's a passage that I wanted to bring up that I feel like speaks to some of the positive vision, too, that underrates these two books. So will you both humor me to read a little bit?
I'm so excited. Anytime Ahmed's read, I'm here. I'm here for it.
She's so great. She's so great. Okay. And I think this one really speaks to some of what you get into in From the Clinic to the Streets. Okay. Willfulness is ordinary stuff. It can be a daily grind. This is also how an experience of willfulness is world creating. Willful subjects can recognize each other, can find each other, and create spaces of relief, spaces that might be breathing spaces, spaces in which we can be inventive. If in most spaces we have to be assertive just to be, we can create spaces which give us freedom from that necessity. There can be joy in creating worlds out of the broken pieces of our dwelling spaces. We can not only share our willfulness stories, but pick up some of the pieces too. Close quote.
You chose one of my favorites, which is why it's in the book. Yeah. I mean, how it's so beautiful because it encapsulates what does it mean for us to constantly work against foreclosures and to truly believe that the foreclosures are like imports. They're constructed to feel that way, to have that actual impact, to look like that. But then what does it mean when we come together, she says, willfully to alchemize, right? And create portals where otherwise we don't see them. And for me, that has been the through line, right? Throughout the through line of my work. When I think about what does decolonial work mean outside of like the sexy catchphrases where like Columbia University does a conference on decolonial, work. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what does it mean to constantly push up this against the scenes and know that there is a different world that can come together even when we think we just see walls and barricades and enclosures around us. It's like, Sarah Ahmed leads the way. She's like, nope. And the shit's done relationally. So there's that too.
There's something about this idea of will and the imagery of like in the ruins, sort of like producing a kind of collective counter will. And I hear other tonalities of it too in what you just said about like trying to find a way through the blockages or find some way to produce collectivity amid like rubble, I guess, or where other people from the outside would be like, oh, this is just tragedy and this is just a victim kind of space. Something I really appreciate about your work, and this book in particular, is this both historically grounded and I think revelatory, but also operationally salient and very effective accounting of the ways in which like a recognizable psychoanalytic perspective is involved like elementally in this entire kind of counterinsurgent, occupationist, policing as counterinsurgency as occupation, like both mode of warfare, mode of governmentality, right? This kind of the way that psyche is a battlefield and that there is this contest of wills, or like what is oftentimes framed as a contest of wills that, well, I think there's something, again, so clarifying about this book in particular. We're going to be singing its praises to everyone listening to this. Please, if you're listening to this already, go buy it. But I found myself thinking about how, now this is dating about 10 years ago, people would be talking about how, like, what are the uses of theory, these sort of abstract conversations. And some people would sometimes be like, oh, well, here's an article about how the IDF is using Deleuze, right? And I remember being like, what's actually the core nugget here? And it was, I guess there's some colonel in the IDF whose whole thing was, well, we're going to re-territorialize the West Bank or whatever by just driving through walls. And I don't think they actually needed
Deleuze for that.
Like, you just need a fucking bulldozer, right? And
that's right.
But then I was like, oh, actually, no, the real theory that has always already been there, operationalized, weaponized, but then effaced, and which I think there is actually a legitimate liberatory task of reclaiming, which is precisely what you're doing, is thinking about, well, psychic energies in terms of creation of counterwill, but also of just like resistance as producing a response to repression, which is something other than self-punitive. It's generative.
Absolutely.
It's a wellspring, and it's just commendable.
Yes. No, I really appreciate that. And I think one of the things you're already pointing to is that, are we attuned to those worlds that exist simultaneously? Because we can look at the world, like we are drawn in to attune to the world where the IOF soldier uses Deleuze, rather than what you just said is like, actually, no, you just drive it, you might sexify it with Deleuze and make it look like it's some sort of intellectual exercise, but you have the entire imperial and settler colonial force behind you. And you actually don't need Deleuze to do that. But what does it mean for us to attune to on the ground what is happening in defiance of those bulldozers? When you go through a wall, here I'm thinking about E.L. Weitzman, of course, talking about Nablus, for example, and for what forensic architecture does. And it's just like, the IOF needed to go through people's homes because there was an entire network of relationality that was there and that pre-existed the settler state and that was used to defy dismemberment. That's why it happened. So there's also a way in which when we attune to those layers of existence, we're also doing the work of a truth-telling of material reality and a fighting against the inversions. And that's part of, obviously, I talk about psychic inversions in the book. It's like there is a political, cultural, affective, emotional, psychic currency to us walking through this in the way that you just did.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported and kept ad-free for everyone through the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to get an additional 2 paywalled episodes per month, including our Journey Through Freud's Standard Edition and our Wild Analysis episodes with Takes Too Spicy to be in front of the paywall, come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blackshield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome the author of one of our most awaited titles of 2026. Lara Sheehi is a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, a licensed clinical psychologist, and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. Lara's work focuses on psychoanalysis, the psychic refusals central to liberation struggles and life-making in the global South, the psychic dimensions of resistance and revolution, and critical Zionism studies. She is the author of From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, which is just out as of a few days ago from Pluto, and co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, a book that we cannot recommend more highly. Lara is a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and is on the advisory board for forensic architecture. Lara, welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness. We are so excited to talk with you today. We're huge admirers of your work.
Thank you so much for having me. Same here.
So let's get into it. We have so many questions for you about the new book, but we always like to ask, especially clinicians who come on our show, to situate you before we even get into like, tell us about your book, tell us about how your whole, of et cetera. Can you tell us a little bit about your path to psychoanalysis?
Sure. I love this question because I think, part of what I do in the book is like, what the fuck, why psychoanalysis? So this is a good backdrop. In some ways it's not an original story. I was an English literature major, and that's where psychoanalysis lives.
Yeah.
Right. It's not in psychology. It's in English literature. And that's where I was introduced to Lacan and Freud, and it was alive and well. And at the same time, I was doing classes in psychology, and I'm just like, there's nothing here that's speaking to me in this way. This was at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And so the entry point was like an opening in a critical space where you're taking up text and discourse in a particular way. And I think I'm so grateful that's how I was introduced to psychoanalysis, not as an applied theory, but as a conceptual sort of framework. Because for me, I also then felt at home in a theory that I felt had the capaciousness to take up contradictions. Here I was in Lebanon, post-Iraq invasion. I wanted desperately a theory that could help me organize the world, understand desires, understand why people, fell under the spell of capitalism. There were, passages about identifications. There were cool, kick-ass psychoanalysts that were also Marxist, and I didn't have to leave that behind. There was Fanon. So that is what made me go into psychoanalysis. And then I moved to the United States for graduate school to study psychoanalysis. I went to the last remaining doctoral program that was purely psychoanalytic. And I very quickly learned, oh, wait a second, that theory remained a theory. And the way it's practiced is not this at all. Like, it didn't cash out on its promises. And I think for me, that was really important as a Lebanese Arab. The fact that the applied theory didn't cash out on the promises of the actual textual and conceptual framework that I had fallen into and come to love and felt like there was so much promise, for me is a central part of the journey to become, I think, a critic of psychoanalysis, a critic of the Institute of Psychoanalysis as a theory, method, and practice. So I never tell the story of coming into it without telling the story of how they lost me. And I think that's actually really important, because many of us who get into psychoanalysis are primed because we're theory fiends. We love it. We fall in love with what it means. And I think the sordid and tragic story of psychoanalysis as a practiced method, particularly as we know it through a Eurocentric frame, is a story also of losing people and losing dissidents and ejecting the people who are just like, wait a second, there could be so much more here. And what you all are doing is actually siding with the state and siding with power to have a hold on power as they see it, as a hegemonic force versus being relevant. So all of that is my journey into psychoanalysis.
So many of our listeners will already know you from your previous work, especially the wonderful Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, co-authored by Lara Sheehi. But before we dig deeply into the new book, which is the full title is From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, can you tell our listeners about that project as a whole and a little bit about its connection with the previous book?
I think the through line, but I would say with all my work, but certainly with these two books together, is that they are not pretending not to be political. And I think that's not at all, right? And I think this is I draw from, I always say this in Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon, in the first page, second paragraph, he's just like, I'm not going to even try to be objective. I'm a Black man. How does one do that? And I take that seriously. I take that seriously, not as an empty identity politics position, but as one of a political commitment to the world, where the theories that we are brought up in, or the theories that we find ourselves, finding a home in, or helping us orient ourselves to the world, are ones that also do material work, that they're not actually disconnected from the lives and everyday negotiations that people have to make, right? And as one of many tools towards what is most important to me is the surety of our liberation and futures that hold a different world than the extractive, exploitative, dominating world that we find ourselves in right now. So that is the most immediate, connection here, that both these books have a political demand. And I say this in this book, that it's not just like an ask, it's a political demand. And what I mean by that is, it means that there's a commitment that comes with that. It means that there's a discipline to what it means to move through the world holding these realities in mind. It means that there are political practices that we have to involve ourselves in. I think I have always, since graduate school, just back to the question of psychoanalysis, since graduate school, I have been very much committed to what does it mean to excavate spaces of psychoanalysis otherwise. If I learned from Black feminists like Gail Lewis and Feluke Taylor, who would teach us that there have always been spaces where psychoanalysis has been practiced as a theory and method, even in its non-institutionalized ways. But what are the ways in which we can start to pay attention to that? This is part of the reason why I think political prisoners factor so heavily in this book. Militants, people who have always understood the centrality of the psyche and affect in both power, but also in the ways that they remain committed to their political projects. So I think this is what I would say is at the centerpiece of this book. Wanting to think about, what does it mean to seize psychoanalysis towards liberatory ends? What does it mean to actually demand that this must be the starting point? Otherwise, there's no point to the theory, to the practice, to any skill that psychoanalysts would purport that they have. For me, if it's disconnected from its material impact, and if it's disconnected from the political project of disrupting and dismantling the oppressive systems that asphyxiate the most vulnerable among us, there's no point at all. There's just absolutely, I just can't, it's a irreconcilable position for me. And I'm not going to do the song and dance of pretending that there's a separation between these things. I've worked very hard, I think, in every part of my world, whether that's clinical, theoretical, teaching, to align with a revolutionary politics that can do even a small part of pushing forward the project of liberation. And I think that I feel so grateful that I had a press that allowed me to write in this way and be able to be unbending and to kind of do like a parallel process in vivo exercise of what I was actually trying to convey in the message of what does it mean to not take a breath and be unbending and hold a line and not let up.
I find what you're saying in response to this question, in light of your response to the previous question, and just putting the works in conversation, and then putting also your own trajectory into and then out of institutional psychoanalysis in conversation with the production of these works, and with Fanon in the background, really clarifying and striking. What I want to say, honestly, is that I just find this all, your work, and admirable. And I mean this in multiple senses, right? And not even just morally and politically. I think, take that as read. But the refusal to abide by a certain type of contradiction, or the awareness that having to sit with a contradiction and then not work with that one way or another is untenable, right? And I'm thinking about this in particular in terms of, well, the way you describe, it's very, I'm very sympathetic to this, the interest in psychoanalysis conjured from outside of psychoanalysis, from outside of a clinical space, and particularly along the axis of how psychoanalytic theory, in a way I don't think other epistemological, discursive traditions give us, offers a real toolkit for thinking about and documenting all the different ways in which we are primed unconsciously with no say in the matter before we are born to identify not just with individuals in our quote unquote family, but with entire states of affairs, with the status quo, with like even the idea of authority as such, right? And that is an incredibly fecund and provocative, but also I think like difficult thing
Troubling.
to say. Yeah, it has implications, right? And it's so attractive that, you know, I speak from experience too, like wanting to enter into learn more, right? And to identify with that project, I identify some better part of myself in the way that stimulates me. And then you go into the institution, you identify with the people who are supposedly bringing you the institution, or sort of like the, you know, the gatekeepers, credentializers, authorities in that space. And then they're like, no, don't make this about other types of identifications. We're talking about the family in this particular form, right? And in the background of this is, you know, I think about the opening chapters of Black Skin, White Masks, right? Where Fanon is like, look, this was a dissertation. And my dissertation committee was like, you're bearing the fact that you're a Black man writing this, and that's a problem for us. And then he not only publishes the receipts of this, which is incredible, but says what I take you to also be saying in some register, namely that disavowing the politics, or rather what you are disavowing your positionality and your investment and the implications of this body of knowledge in general, is not quote unquote just like being political or particularist. You would have to disavow. The disavowal is actually already a politics. And having to, you know, maybe understandably,
that's
learn
a good
something,
way to put it.
Yeah, you want to inhabit it. I can understand on some like general level, like you learn so many things, maybe at some point you want to stop thinking you just want to like do the thing and train other people. But if what we're talking about is, again, as important as like how everyone relates to power, like it or not, right? How the positionality of the things that we call apolitical is just as political as the things that we want to exclude as political, then if you don't, again, and this is just the thing I find so admirable, if you don't follow that through to its conclusion, or rather consistently keep an eye on that as you draw multiple conclusions and circumstances change, you're going to get that's going to cost you somehow. You're going to be trapped conceptually. You're going to enact in other ways. It's a type of stasis and torpor that also can be allied with some of the worst possible projects, politically speaking.
Absolutely. And that's the conscription, and that's the seduction. And I think part of this book is how do we militantly remain focused, like you're saying, on the fact that power is engaged on every level and will constantly invite us into these positions of disavowal as part of its political project. And any of our engagements, particularly with psychoanalysis, because this is the sort of the terrain that we're talking about, it's not innocent. It's a political wager. There's a political wager that's involved. And I think our invitation to disavow that is part of how a social order is reproduced, right? And that it is built in constitutively to the theory to expel that knowledge. That is the disavowal at the heart of it. Expel literal people who tell you that, because that's the history of psychoanalysis as well. But theoretically, and that's what I mean, is like, here's a theory that could be primed to take this up. And how interesting is it for us to be like, at every moment in which that could potentially happen, that we are in touch with the realities of how power, to quote Sarah Ahmed, works on us and through us. Mm-hmm. There's an escape latch that happens, and people return to the most conservative elements of that theory. That is not accidental. That is about reproducing social hierarchies, power, supremacy. And that's the story we need to tell if we're going to contend with this and antagonize it in a way so it can't settle within us or within our collectives with ease, at the very least. Like, that's, I think, if the take home of the book is like, at the very least, can we remain in antagonistic relation to these processes?
So I want to get into some of the specifics of the claims, and to use the word that you just invoked a few moments ago, the demands of the new book. And one of those demands is your call for what you term a despecialized psychoanalysis. And that's a call that both responds to present conditions and reflects a frank confrontation with how, historically speaking, as we've just been saying, psychoanalysis has functioned as a tool for both revolutionaries and authorities across different geopolitical theaters and psychic landscapes. You focus in particular on the era of decolonization, which witnessed both the work of Frantz Fanon and the development of psychodynamic counterinsurgency theory. So I'm hoping we can spend some time sketching out the broad history of those institutional forces and turn to why you see Fanon in particular as offering singular insights for our particular contemporary moment. And I want to make sure in particular that our listeners get to hear you think out loud about this despecialization of psychoanalysis, because it's different from like what Freud's talking about when he talks about like the question of a lay analysis, right? And also about your insistence, and you are, really clear about this from the jump in the book, that in a vital sense, psychoanalysis begins with not Freud, but Fanon. And I want to make sure our listeners get to hear a little bit from you on this subject. Here is a snippet of Lara. Quote, "Beginning psychoanalysis with Fanon as opposed to Freud is not an anachronistic reading of psychoanalysis, nor is it a glitch in the timeline, or, as one psychoanalyst once screamed at me, a dismissal of Freud's labor. Rather, beginning with Fanon announces our intention to use psychoanalysis from the clinic to the streets as one of many tools for our fight against oppressive forces, rather than a stabilizing force that insists people must increasingly psychically adapt to the oppression wrought by capitalism, imperialism, climate catastrophe, etc." Close quote. So I just threw a whole lot of things at you, but Fanon, despecialization, wherever you want to start.
Yeah, bring it on, right? This is the part that makes psychoanalysts love me. Let me tell you that.
Oh, I'm sure.
Sure.
Which already, like some of these examples where I have, you kind of look at it and you're like, what? Is this real? But this is what we're talking about. We're already in the terrain of what makes psychoanalysis and its adherents come undone, which goes back to, I think, Patrick's position of like, you are asked to be totalizing in your actual commitments to an institution, a theory. And that's why it's an ideology. Like there is an invitation to tether your identity to this thing. And therefore any challenge that comes up against it, like ushers in this massive psychic collapse, which actually gave me some pause when I first came into psychoanalysis, being like, what is happening? Because for me, if you believe in your theory, if you actually believe in your theory, it can handle contradictions. It's going to be okay. If you believe in power, also, like power reconstitutes itself and recalibrates right in front of our eyes. So there was always something so peculiar about the coming undone, which told me there was something else identificatory that was happening that wasn't being attended to, right? Which is also psychoanalytic. It's like psychoanalysis 101. But this is why I think about, let's start with this, like psychoanalysis begins with Fanon. And it is on one hand a provocation. I know consciously what I'm doing when I say that. I understand. And also it is one way in which I commit to the politics of this project that I want to also be very public about. I'm not here to cut corners. I'm here to say, what would it mean if we truly committed to undoing and dismantling the oppressive structures that are built in constitutively to the theory of psychoanalysis as we know it right now, as a hegemonic theory. And that would have to be a starting point for me, because there's something about reclaiming also, if we think about psychoanalysis as, let's say, the most sort of preeminent modern, right, practice of modernity, right, of subject making, of the making of the individual. It is the European invention where it starts, even though part of what I track through the book is that there have been versions of psychoanalysis, and certainly what we do in psychoanalysis under occupation is say there are modes of psychoanalytic thought and inquiry and curiosity that predate Freud, certainly, and also European Enlightenment, right? So But if we start there, if we say, okay, in the form that we know it, this is a European invention that sort of comes out of that region. And in this particular moment, we cannot tell that story without also telling the story of colonialism and the story of resource extraction from the global South. And at the same time, literally the extraction of interiorities of Black, Indigenous, and Brown people the world over in experiments that were done in the name of psychology and psychoanalysis. Because at the time, most of the people who were psychologists were also psychoanalysts. That was the time we were doing. So the most spectacular of these cases, of course, are like MK Ultra and COINTELPRO. But this psychoanalysis had a hand in the actual excavation and the use of peoples to create the theory, even if Freud was not involved in that, even though anybody who goes to Freud's office and sees all the artifacts that are there and the stolen artifacts, that's the story right in front of us. So I'm interested in a Fanonian sense of what does it mean to be decolonization, to be a process of perpetual disorder. How I understand that is it's not chaos. It means that when you overturn normativity, of course, it's going to look like disorder. But there's what he also tells us is putting things back in their rightful place, right? And to reclaim and understand that the story of psychoanalysis is the story of extraction, of domination, and exploitation. And starting with Fanon, that's what I mean by announces our position. There's something important publicly for us to do. To say, of course, and that's why I say I'm not engaging in historical revisionism. I understand timelines, but also if we take the theory at its word and understand the unconscious doesn't have timestamps, what happens that this is the place where people trip up and then all of a sudden want to be concrete and the unconscious doesn't exist, right? Like the unconscious exists until it doesn't anymore for some psychoanalysts, which to me then is a confession about the ideological investments that are there. Because if you're the theory that you love so much and you're willing to die on this hill and you don't want anybody to change it, you don't even believe it to the point where you can handle when somebody's trying to sort of disrupt it in a particular way. So it's a reclamation of that. It's also one way in to say that Fanonian psychoanalysis is one that is already primed for revolutionary action. It is a starting point that never took the bait to say that there is a separation between the intrapsychic and the social and the political. He gives us that, right? I mean, again, we go back to Black Skin, White Masks. He says, I'm a Marxist first and I'm a psychoanalyst second. Like there is no separation between these things. And I think his actual commitment to alleviating the psychic suffering of people come from his own commitments as an anti-capitalist and an anti-colonial revolutionary fighter. He was a gun runner. Like this is the other thing that's also displaced all the time is that he often finds himself in post-colonial studies or in Black studies where he belongs as a revolutionary Black thinker. But it's also telling that in the clinical canon, he never shows up. And if he does, we're having these inane conversations about whether or not he meant violence. And it's like, he did mean violence. He meant violence. He was a gun runner, and I think gives us something also to say, what are our responsibilities because of our commitments to the theory and the praxis of psychoanalysis to subvert the ways in which power can use this towards oppression. And the answer he gave us is we actually have a role in this. Instead of being confusion mongers, like he tells us in Wretched of the Earth, we have to find ways to use our position to make sure that we are actually committed to the alleviation of suffering. So harboring FLN militants and passing along information is one way to do that. Let me give a sort of a current day example of that. There are many clinicians who are having these very real conversations when we think about ICE death squads coming into clinics and hospitals and kidnapping people. So these are the conversations they're having about what does it mean for us to have to rethink the way that we do clinical work? And that might mean going underground. That might mean rethinking these very sterile ways that we think about our quote unquote ethics, right? Like who is our commitment actually to? And I think that is something that Fanon does. the final thing that I'll say is, here is where I borrow from revolutionary martyr Bassel al-A'raj, who's a Palestinian martyr and revolutionary, who talked about al-mufakkir al-mushtabik, which means, roughly translated, the engaged intellectual. Because in his position, he was like, what is the point of any intellectual endeavor if it isn't also engaged with the liberatory project in the material world of alleviating suffering? And so that is also a translation. For me, Fanon is, an example of that. Like, I think there's something here about us always reaching to what we have to create. And that is something we should be doing consistently. Reading Fanon as a comrade means, what do we need of him right now? He can't be everything for us because he was also writing and acting in a particular moment. But there's something about the erasure of him that tells us something about the pattern of these larger structures, writing out every moment in history in which there has been a disruption in the timeline, that gives us also an outline and an invitation to what type of commitments we need to have, right? If we are going to be in alignment with the liberatory project of psychoanalysis. Now, of course, we also have examples from Latin America and liberation psychology. And all these folks were very intimately involved in the psychoanalytic canon and how we think through those things. So when I talk about despecialization, it's also following a tradition. It is not like, I make it very clear in the book, like a lot of this is condensing the things that I have learned over the 15 plus years I have been in the field. And my only commitment is that I do not keep that, behind a clinic wall. That actually, one of the things that I learned from somebody like Che Guevara on revolutionary medicine is the ways in which the actual process of specialization, right, of professionalization actually is a state counterinsurgent project that privatizes knowledge that belongs to everybody, right? And here's, like, we can think about the Zapatistas as well, like everything for everybody, not as a sort of lofty utopian idea, even though I'm all about that, but as a literal concrete way for us to rethink how we can use the tools that are already available to us. And that is the only way I think psychoanalysis should and can survive. I'm not interested in it surviving if it's not used towards those ends. I talk about not being proselytizer for psychoanalysis. I think I've just said this before, that power will recalibrate in front of our eyes. Psychoanalysis will be fine. That's why it's having its heyday again, even though it doesn't deserve it, right? But if there is anything to gather from it, if there's anything, it must be a project of seizing it as a theory, as a method, as a practice from the hands of the architects that mean to keep it as an exclusive private project that reproduces normativity and a social order that will only shore up supremacy, fascism as we see it right now, capitalist plunder. Like, that's the only possible outcome of it. Right. So a despecialized psychoanalysis for me would be one in which every single day we commit to disrupting its ability to do that.
There's just so much in what you're saying that I find so sympathetic in the narrative, right? And I think the two things I kind of want to underscore, but also just mirror back to you, and then hopefully also I want to draw some other listeners into pursuing some of these lines of flight and inquiry is, well, the first thing, I'm just so struck by that encounter with the analyst who is like, you're disowning, you're disrespecting Freud's labor, right? Which is wild. I mean, immediately it obviously codes as, you're disavowing my labor. I had to learn all this fucking Freud. How dare you come at this in some other way that doesn't reproduce my own apprenticeship and particular peccadillos. And never mind.
Yeah, because poor Freud, right? Nobody mentions Freud. How would we forgot?
Right? Yeah, never mind that psychoanalysts really they'll invoke Freud as the name of the father, and it's all about Daddy Freud. But apparently, they also want us to cherish him the way I don't know, I'm supposed to cherish the Virgin Mary or the mother when I do certain types of Buddhist meditation, right? He's both carrying us in his womb and also our big dad. People want to have it both ways. But the second half of it is, if some part of me wants just so what that you would choose to, and I think it's an admirable choice, to produce Or to draw on, I'm thinking of our conversation with Olufemi Taiwo about this, to like have a genealogy or an ancestor perspective where you invoke Fanon as like being central in that firmament. You're putting Fanon in the center of that it's not, as you say, I mean, because clearly you know what you're doing. It's not historical revisionism. It's not histrionics. It is a gesture. And it makes me, again, question, like, well, clearly there is not a historical revisionism, but there's a kind of frozenness, presumably, or like what at least is going on when psychoanalysts reflexively have to like, well, Freud himself, right? What does it mean that you have to continually go back to that, right? That's clearly a type of temporal movement or a type of refusal to move in time. And that in and of itself, it's unmarked, but ubiquitous to the point that, Freud himself wrote and said many more things than, Sigmund Freud ever did. And yet somehow we keep going back to him, which is a strange thing to be caught in.
Psychoanalysis is more obsessed with lineage than anywhere outside of like, I don't know, dog breeding or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there is, I think what you're doing is like a defiliation, something like that. Is that a word? And then a refiliation. And it doesn't surprise me that you would get pushback that would see this as like a sort of naive move, when in fact it is a move of like, I guess I want to valence this in a complimentary way. So hear it that way, of like a move of like deep political cunning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Which is Basil al-Araj too. He talks about the cunning of indigenous resistance.
Yeah.
It feels like just survival too, like in the sense that like I don't know, I think about all these like the dogs that are like specially bred, and then like they're really, sure, they're really pure, but then they walk down a staircase and like their spines get stuck, or like their faces melt because they've got like there is inbred as the Habsburgs or something, like a despecialized sort of generalist, if you will, like a mutt kind of thinking, actually has a durability and can reproduce and is generally more fun and also
and relevant.
Yeah, and also like they need to be adopted. So please go to the local shelter and get these guys. But
it's the same move also is what I'm trying to point out with the defiliation. Despecialization is also doing this sort of decoupling from the repetition of the structures of like,
yes,
I have to become the authority in this way.
Yes. And it also commits us to, and maybe this is why it's scary, of like that something will emerge when you despecialize, and that the reliance on the structure and the institute to hold all the possibilities, there is only one possible outcome to that. And that is an ossification, because you have to be totalizing in your commitment and adherence to that, because that becomes the focus. The displacement then becomes the structure. It's like, this is the structure that I must defend at all costs. And we see this, and we've seen that story. Like, I'm not the one to tell that story, but it is a confessional that when you bring this in and you go, no, I insist, psychoanalysis begins with Fanon. Just watch that process unfold. So there's also a disruption. Like, the political cunning is also saying, I understand that disruption is needed,
right?
Because this ossification is built around it's almost like concretized, it's like concrete that will just stay in place, but it's also so fucking brittle. Because ideology needs that constant feeding to stay in its place. And if we come in with a disruption, there's actually a political project there.
It strikes me also, and not to get too hung up on the lineage part, but I'm going back to Sarah Ahmed and willfulness, and the figure that she starts with is the figure of the willful child, who is a girl whose arm keeps being raised up until the point where her mother literally beats her, like her corpse, even her, like she dies. And even in death, as they're trying to bury her, her arm goes up. You can't see me, but I'm doing that. And her mother has to beat her, and then finally, like, they all bury her. And she is, Ahmed doesn't use this word, but it does seem to me that in, just looking at the way that you're being told something like this is a dismissal of Freud's labor, because labor here also, it makes me think also very much, it's not just the clinical space, it's domestic space. Is what you're being told is that you, in reconfiguring psychoanalysis and your relation to it as meaningful only insofar as a fundamentally emancipatory horizon, you are an ungrateful daughter, right? That it is a question.
Absolutely.
I think about this a little bit in terms of, my own kind of discipline is philosophy, which is, I hate most of those people. Like, why have I spent so much of my life trying to please them? Right.
Yes.
But, you are a clinician and you are still, you're fighting psychoanalysis, but you're in its house, right?
Oh,
You're rebuilding the house at the same time. I think the question of ingratitude is one that's like less thematized, but that is a lot of what is at stake.
Yes, which is racism. And that's Fanon as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head, because there's this relational demand, which I talk about in the book too, like the unspoken relational coercion that is always involved in these exchanges, which theoretically psychoanalysis is positioned to read as a process, like what is happening here in this process. But instead, again, the unconscious just disappears anytime you're just like, what is happening here when you're mobilizing this idea of labor, both in terms like who constitutes having actual labor in the material historical reality of the world. Do you actually think that Freud's the one who labored here in the context of the global South and how Europe was built? Like, even that confession there, if you're a psychoanalyst, you should be primed to read all that. The story I was going to tell you is that very recently, a very senior psychoanalyst was speaking to another senior psychoanalyst who told me this and said these exact words: "We let Lara into the field and she blew it up from the inside." That, I can't make this shit up. This was like 2 weeks ago. We don't even have to go into like the sleeper cell, Arabness, all of that. But to your point about gratitude, and if you little brown girl from the global South don't show proper gratitude to being let in, and these are that's what I mean about like, psychoanalysis is already despecialized in the service of shoring up colonialism, capitalism, and exploitation. Right. But anytime we come out with that and say, you all are already joining the state in doing this stuff, even though your public persona is that you have nothing to do with this, but the sordid history and current day process, like all the anti-trans bills that are being passed in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, are in consultation with psychoanalysts. Like, you're already despecializing it, but you're despecializing towards those ends. So like, and we're going to wrench that from you, and we're going to use it towards revolution.
I'm still reeling from that, the blowing, like the suicide bomber kind of insurgent fifth column shit there, like, which is so fucked in so many different levels. And it seems like another one of these examples of like, personally, I think ruthless critique of everything existing is a good thing, right? Or at least it is a type of love for the world or a type of engagement that is better than the alternative, which is like critique that then stops. And when you're like, yeah, I own the theory now. And I don't want to be too glib about this, but part of me feels like the almost, you can't make this shit up character of some of these enactments. It's like a case of right when you think you own the theory, that's when the theory owns you. Right. That's when you own yourself doing something so stupid and so just like blatantly fucked that it's amazing. Like, again, you couldn't make this shit up. Right. But the thing I wanted to circle back to, just to underscore and mirror back to you. And again, because I really do want to like not recruit, but like encourage other people to plumb some of these waters, is the thread involving, on the one hand, the creation of expertise or the recognition of expertise as essentially a tool of bureaucratic control, but also of legitimation that is bound up not just in sort of stuff that happens in the imperial core and processes of professionalization, but is a classic defining tool of colonial and neocolonial empire and post-imperial structures, where you are literally credentializing elites and producing relationships of, racializing various differences in order to produce technologies of control. The obvious fact that the people who brought us this body of knowledge, discursive traditions, et cetera, that we would call counterinsurgency theory, were all, just for historically contingent reasons, trained in classical Freudian psychoanalysis and ego psychology, and that therefore there would be overlapping with this. This is a thought. This is again, one of these things that should be just given in its obviousness. And yet, to underscore again, like this problem of recognizing the obvious, but also like histrionic disavowal. And for about a decade now, I've been doing a course on like repression theory, right? Which is essentially a psychodynamic accounting of counterinsurgency theory in different directions. And I do it in different patterns in different years. Like some years I'll focus more on like the French school, in Algeria, or I'll do the Malay and British variations, or I always try and force other people to read a lot of like David Petraeus just because he's so contemptible, right? That line about how counterinsurgency is the graduate school of warfare. I'm like, again, talk about owning yourself, motherfucker.
Wait, I'm hearing that for the first time.
Oh yeah.
That's bonkers.
Yeah, he's got two, it's I think FM23, whatever the field manual is, he revises it, but he begins with, also all these guys are completely homoerotically involved with Mao. Like a lot of this stuff is literally, this is what Mao says, so let's say let's bet out Mao. Right, like more
really
more problems or whatever. That's another. There's several puns going on there. Yeah, he actually has this initial thing where he's like, he describes normal like Clausewitzian warfare is like undergraduate study, but the graduate school of warfare is counterinsurgency theory. And again, if anyone's ever met or been a fucking graduate student, like, what are you talking about? And also, my man then goes on to do exactly what a lot of people do after they graduate graduate school, namely get into fucked up sexual relationships with people who idolize them. But that's neither here nor there. The point here that I'm getting at is that in the years that I have been doing this and building various bibliographies, of which you were an elemental part, Dagmar Herzog's in there, Daniel Carr is in there too, right? It is, on the one hand, like as people try to do these affiliations of like, well, this is how, these different occupying powers have national styles, et cetera, the real through line through all of this is a fundamentally psychodynamic perspective. Even the very idea of like the multiple senses of repression, right? Or the fact that, it's another one of these things that they're always some weird tick in all these institutions is why? Well, why is the repressed returning? Well, motherfuckers, you want it to return. That's the point of the structure. You know this, and that they forget it. And I say this having the experience of I have dear friends who have had various like come to Lenin, come to Freud moments actually after leaving the service, or I've even had like senior military psychologists. I've had think tank people in this class, and people who I think would know better, right? We want to like use occupation, right, as a Besetzung translation, or just these ideas of, as you began the beginning, like the work of counterinsurgency is to lacerate and traumatize the social fabric over intergenerational timeline, right? These are basic things. I only have access to this because of just my sort of like magpie kind of comparative, despecialized generalist nature. People who are in the driver's seat of some of these operations or have left them or are historians of it will be like, what do you mean? We don't talk about like penis envy and this shit. There's no Freud here. And that erasure, which goes beyond just the internal history of psychoanalysis of itself, is... Again, I don't want to sound like conspiratorial in the naive kind of sense, but it's so obvious and yet so disavowed at the same time that I feel like it's a domain that cries out for more work, historicizing, drawing connections, and then also like operationalizing towards the other ends than imperial occupation. And,
that's right.
Yeah, and even just the idea of confusion, as you use it, right? The idea that confusion is produced and dispositive of something is, again, it's psychological warfare 101, you might say, but it's also something that, well, I'd rather talk about it as like reverie, or I just tuned out, or I don't want to think about it. Like you don't want to use your own tools to turn back and think about both the history of your field and the power structures that may be curtailing how you actually think about the use of those tools.
Absolutely. And none of that is innocent. None of it is innocent.
Another way to think about despecialization but the ways that you are giving your readers, regardless of whether they are activists or analysts or therapists, I mean, you're talking to people above all, at least this is my reading of the book. You are talking to people who share a political horizon with you, not only people who are themselves in the clinic one way or another. And it struck me that even though I think this is a beautiful work of theory, that it is also like this incredibly practical toolkit for how to stay focused, how to stay clear-headed. And there's two key and related terms from the book that we need to get into to really dig into this. First is what you call psychic intrusions. And then the second is the really vital concept of psychic militancy that you develop throughout the book to resist these intrusions. So before we even start to unpack Lara, what is psychic militancy and what can we do with it? Let's get a little bit more granular about psychic intrusions. So what are psychic intrusions? Where do they come from? How do they manifest in individuals, in groups? What are their functions? How do you know when a psychic intrusion is happening? How can you detect it? And what do you mean when you refer to them as having a distinctive psychic grammar? So that's a lot of questions, but I'm hoping that you can offer up some examples too. The book is so rich with them, both within clinical and activist contexts. And both Patrick and I found those examples really illuminating as we thought more deeply about the idea of psychic intrusions as you describe them.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is why I wanted to have examples. And I was very specific about having examples, also what we might call mundane examples, because for me, the spaces that sell themselves as the most organic are already spaces that have transformed into normativity and we don't even realize them, which is actually a centerpiece of this grammar of psychic intrusions, is that how do things that power does and mobilizes within us come to hide seamlessly. I mean, one version of that, we can call it ideology, normativity. This is the world that we live in. And the purpose of that is to make us feel like this is just how it's going to be. And there's something very natural and organic about this. And it goes back to functioning on foreclosures, because there's an actual purpose to that, making us feel that the world we live in is the only possibility, is not just an abstract concept. It's one that actually does the ideological work of power to make sure we stay in our place and ensure the longevity of power and oppression. That it shores that up. There's no other way around it. It needs us to do that. It needs us to actually take that in, introject it, internalize it, if we're going to use psychoanalytic terms, and really believe that. So when I started to think about psychic intrusions, it really came up as, I would be particularly, the urgency came when, the genocide in Gaza began after Tawafan al-Aqsa on October 7th, 2023, where I would hear people over and over again from the couch, so to speak, but also comrades, friends, people that I was engaged in tell me, I feel crazy. And there was something so interesting to me in that, and also tragic, right? Because these same people were the people that were detailing to me in excruciating detail precisely what they were seeing. And they were tethered to material reality. They were tethered to the material reality of settler colonial genocidal state that could only end up doing this, right? If we were to track its history, it's an annihilationist, eliminationist ideology that it is wed to, right? And these were the same people that said, it must be me. The localizing within the individual and the pathologizing of there's something I'm missing here. So that became a really interesting space for me to go, what is happening in this moment in which someone can, on the one hand, recount and understand and follow and track material reality and still feel like they're the ones going crazy. So I was like, there's some sort of intrusion that's happening psychically, which made me then come to this realization that oftentimes we talk about oppressive systems functioning and we become symptomatic after the fact. That like capitalism makes us symptomatic after the fact, or imperialism, plunders the earth and we become symptomatic after the fact. And these experiences and me consolidating it into this idea of psychic intrusion meant, wait a second, if we call it an intrusion, and that's naming it is really important. Talk about the willful part of it, is accurately and precisely naming things, which every revolutionary I talk about in the book is very concerned with precision. And because lexical warfare is a thing, as Dylan Rodriguez tells us, where words themselves become the theaters with which these psychic warfare is waged on us, is that what would it mean to say, this is not a byproduct of structures of oppression? Our feeling crazy, our confusion, as Patrick was saying before, our exhaustion, our fear, our despair, those are all examples that I use as affective registers, symptomatic registers of when a psychic intrusion is happening. You can think about that as maybe the point of contact, that we're alerted to the fact that a psychic intrusion is happening because we become aware of this affect. Those affective registers become a signal to us that something is happening on us and through us. Again, to go back to Sarah Ahmed, because for me, it became like, what would it be if we thought about the actual point of these oppressive structures is the theft of the psyche, that it's not a byproduct of this, that if we think about ideological processes as expansionist in nature, whether it's capitalism is constantly expanding and growing, like it's ever expanding growth, that is actually nothing natural or organic about that, or imperialism as having no borders, or Zionism as being about the greater project of theft of land. I started to think about the psyche having to be implicated in that for these structures of power to do their full violence, they would have to also be able to steal our psychic process as well. And again, not as a byproduct, but as a central point, which then led me to think that means our psyche is contested space, right? And that's why I think it's really important for us to name them intrusions, because calling this process psychic intrusion reminds us that there's a directed attack, that this is part of the political project. And so the precision of that, to say it's an intrusion, means that it's coming from outside. There's an actual target that's happening. There's a mobilization. What the psychological operations people would call it is a force multiplier, right? They give us the words for this. They call themselves psy warriors, and they use force multipliers to make the impact bigger, to make us feel it. And that's why I borrow from Fanon here, who used psychoaffective once in Wretched of the Earth. And I sort of insert politico-affective because I want us, again, to be clear that this is a political project, that our emotions and our affect are implicated in it. But there's actually a reason why. And the reason primarily is to derail us from our political commitments. Because my position is that oftentimes we think about material concessions. My position and my provocation to us is to say, this happens psychically first, that the theft of the psyche happens. The point is to settle inside of us and reconfigure our interior topography so that we start to accept the possibilities that materially things will actually be stolen. So there are ways in which power recognizes this and says, we actually don't need, traditional warfare anymore. We need psychological warfare, because psychological warfare is precisely what conscripts people. And this is why Petraeus is a really good person to teach, because he's part of these architects have been around for a long time. Now, of course, I say Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, was the, forefather of all of this, saying, hey, there's a thing such as a psyche. There's a thing such as an unconscious. Use that. That is why I'm calling it an intrusion. Now, none of this is meant to mean that we don't have affect states by themselves, or that somehow there's not something natural. What I am saying is, to your point of like, how do we know they're happening, is to clock and register in what moments are these affect states being mobilized and towards what end? What does it stabilize and what does it destabilize? And for me also psychoanalytically is that intrusions come to coerce an action within us. They're not just there to be felt. They're there to lead us into identifications, as we were talking before, to identify with power fully and hopefully seamlessly so we don't even notice we're doing it. But more importantly, with every identification is a coerced disidentification. When you identify with power and how it coheres, or a version of reality that power is insistent that we do, right? There's also a way in which it is asking you, it is demanding of you that you disidentify from the rest. So if you identify with American imperialism, right? Or let's say white feminism or whatever version, we can give an example of that. You are also at once demanded to give up and disrupt any relational identificatory process that will have you align with that militant on the ground. Because the militant then becomes the intruder. The militant then becomes the aggressor. The militant then becomes the person who is disrupting this otherwise pristine world. And if only the militant could be eliminated, then we could go back to brunch.
And now we have Sarah Ahmed again, the person who points out the problem becomes the problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Precisely.
And
exactly.
One of the things that you do here is that, you know, psychic militancy, which, I mean, I see that as really at the heart of the book in many ways. Psychic militancy is not about aggression. It is actually a kind of toolkit for remaining focused, for remaining clear-eyed, and specifically for detecting and subverting psychic intrusions and what you might call like ideological seductions. So I'm hoping that you can tell our listeners a little bit more about your concept of psychic militancy, both in terms, and I think it's clear that whenever we are thinking with you, we are thinking in terms of theory, and we are always thinking likewise in terms of practice.
Absolutely. Yes. And so to start there's a reason why I use the word militancy.
Mm-hmm.
That is my starting point. So again, if we go back, this is where I also use Fanon. That chapter opens up with a beautiful political letter from Fanon and Mujahid in 1957, because once again, the reason for the precondition, where he walks people through. He's in Ghana and he's just like, listen, this reason and sort of compromise that you're asking the FLN to do is bullshit, because the oppressor is not ceding anything. And therefore, the precondition must be liberation. Now, on the surface, that feels very easy for us, those of us who are politically committed. We're like, yeah, of course, we're for liberation. That's where it should start. But when you read that and you truly take in what he's saying, right? It's saying that any movement away from the surety of that, any compromise, any softening of our positions, any enticements that move us away from that needing to be the non-negotiable starting point. Liberation is the non-negotiable starting point. Nothing else we can't start anywhere else. That tells us why militancy is key. It's been really interesting because some people have reached out to me in good faith. These people are in good faith saying, aren't you worried about using the word militancy because it'll put people off? I'm like, this is exactly what I'm saying. But that alone tells us that's the psychic intrusion. These are the rules of order of the world that we have been conscripted into, that tell us the myth and the lie that somehow there are versions of ourselves that we can present that will make power move. And what I'm saying instead, militantly, is to say power already thinks of us in particular ways. That's why it mobilizes these affect states of fear, despair, and all that, because it knows it's going to stop us in our place. And more importantly, it's going to disrupt us and derail and defang our movements, the movements that will be responsible for the changing of the world and bringing into being the liberatory potentials that we all are committed to. Being militant means always knowing that that's power's move. Being militant means that you have a different relationship to risk. That's why I'm also using militant, that you understand that there's a risk involved in this, but you understand that that risk is not of your making. There's risk involved because power has already configured you in that particular way, so that anything you do that has even a whiff of the potential of disrupting power is going to be registered as violent. So what does it mean for us to remain aligned, in full alignment with our commitments? And that is where psychic militancy comes in. Now, the important part of that is it is not unconscious. It is that is what I mean about a political commitment. That's why I use Sarah Ahmed. The willfulness piece of this is that this is every day us waking up and saying, power works in these ways. Power will conscript me. When I feel something, can I question why it's being mobilized in this particular moment? Can I understand that there might be specificities that come from me, my family, my particularities, my identifications? That's why I use particular examples that I do, but then also understand that carceral discipline is meant to be internalized and make us relate to ourselves and others in very specific ways to be able to stabilize power. That if we understand that as a contested space, it allows us to remain militant, if nothing else, in what I said before about being antagonistic towards that, in not letting power tell the story that it always tells about itself. Power intends to work on us in ways because it expects that we will not come up against it. It expects that it can do its violence in secret. That's what abuse is. Power can't be power unless it does that. Unless it exacts its power and enacts its reach, it's not power. It has to actually do an action, right? So the militancy part for me is understand what saturates our world, but understand that also our psyche and our affect, our interiority is a centerpiece to that, not accidental. And more importantly to me, is not collapse and shame when we fall into this. One of the things that I talk about in the book, if we're to follow Fanon, is that it's actually in the moments of practicing deciliation, in those moments where our political commitments are in hyper focus, when we truly hit at the heart of settler colonial logics and not reality bend, that's when we're going to feel violence at its most heightened, potent space. That's when you feel it. And rather than collapse in shame is understand, oh, I'm afraid, number one, because there's something to be afraid of. The state is fucking scary, right? But also to understand, oh, this is the moment in which this is what consciousness means. This is when I'm actually disalienated. This is when I don't believe the stories power tells. This is when I actually enact the solidarity and the belief that the world does not have to look like it does right now. That's why we feel it the most. And this is why this is a book. You were right, Abby, you were saying this before, is like, this is not a book for specialists. This is a book for comrades. This is a book for all of us. Now, there will be specialists that read it. Some will hate read it. Some will, read it because they care about their clinical work. And there are, I think, many more of us who are no longer willing to do the dirty work of power. But really, it is a book for people who are engaged in this every single day. And because they're engaged in it every single day, they are feeling these intrusions the most. And I felt such an urgency to be like, folks, let's keep an eye on this. And here's the way we do this. And part of the reason why I'm in this book and comrades are in this book and there's no separation is because we have to do this together and we have to keep repeating it over and over and over and over again, because that's the story of power too. Repetition is the story of power.
I'm so appreciative of this. And I think it's so, there's so many like traps that are in our discourse to fall into, right? Sometimes I have the mental image of like one of those games where like you get a box and then there's a maze on it and there's like a ball, maybe I don't know what the name of these things are, like a ball bearing, and you got to constantly toggle. You're moving the box on different angles such that you're hopefully moving the little marble so it doesn't fall into one of these holes and you have to start all over again. And at times, particularly on high stakes issues, or things that are siloed in the media as being a high-stage issue. And here I think about conversations I have with people about gun violence, right? Or people that talk about Zionism, like where it's like you're always, some part of your brain, particularly if you're trying to take the content of the conversation seriously, sometimes even to the exclusion of the form, which is the key intervention you make, is that you're always trying to not fall into one of those holes, right? People are like, oh, if you say this, then you must say that. Oh, if you think this person is this, then you must say that. Oh, the logics are completely insane, right? Oh, you like Fanon, so you must want to literally kill me. No, I don't have, like these kind of like, it puts a tremendous amount of burden on you to like walk this kind of tightrope and continually be like, oh, I'm not going to fall in this thing. And there are other, traps here too. And I think there's a person could go astray and be like, oh, is the person who says this to me, when I'm having a dispute about something, like, oh, there's, actually there are two sides to every issue, and the truth is somewhere exactly between the two. To be like, okay, this is, am I literally dealing? I don't want to like Fed jacket this person. Like, am I literally dealing with someone who's getting a check from, I don't know, like the DIA or the Mossad? It's like, but no, it doesn't actually matter. That's another trap too. The thing that matters is keeping eyes on like function. Right. What actually happens in terms of like what conversation, but also what type of relation is being subverted. Right. A mental image I have sometimes is like, I think James Bond's car has this, or like you get these in Grand Theft Auto when you're driving and then you can release the little like spikes, the caltrops, so everyone else starts fishtailing. Right. It's like,
yes,
it's that kind of like the way it's squid.
And it was built to do that.
Yeah,
it was built to do that,
And you got to be like, well, no. Yes. I'm keeping my eyes on the prize. Like I was about to hit this person with the pit maneuver in my car. I'm not going to let this happen. Like somehow you don't overcorrect. And that type of emphasis is so
good,
key.
Actually.
Yeah.
The not overcorrect. Yeah. I was like, where are you going with that? I mean,
no, it's good. And that I think leads to the grammar part of it. That when I say there's a grammar has rules to it. It's not accidental. It's not arbitrary. Power follows rules of engagement. And that doesn't mean that they don't act with impunity. To the contrary, that is actually built into the engagement, right? And that for me, when we track the well-oiled sort of contours of this and the fault lines on which these intrusions happen, that's the psychopolitical affective terrain, then we also are there to disrupt that logic from unfolding unchecked, or at least settling within us without a fight. That's the grammar. And grammar is also patterned. Like those cars that you're talking about is just like, that follows a pattern. There's like an actual plan here for this to happen, and you deploy it in particular moments. You don't just like, as soon as you come out of the fucking box, you drop those fucking things. It's like, no, we use this at particular moments, and we use it when it's heightened, right? When there's a heightened risk that's involved and there's something at stake. That's also part of this.
I want to talk about this idea of repetition, which has come up a little bit, but it is a major feature of your idea of psychic militancy. From the repetition of practices of individual psychic discipline. And, you give a lot of examples of this from the kind of the structuring one early on, where you are on a panel and an extremely disruptive person comes in, and it does a lot of work throughout. But also like the collective need to resist the power of repetition that's exerted by disciplinary powers. So there's like a lot of repetition and a lot of contestation on a whole lot of different levels. And so I want to ask, in terms of your institutional experiences and political engagements with psychoanalysis, what sorts of repetition have you encountered on whatever level, from policy to codes of politesse, which is another word. Liberal politesse does a lot of heavy lifting in this book. So I'm hoping, and I want to read a quick passage, but I'm hoping that you can give us some examples of how militant repetition helps to gain political ground. And I'm asking that partly, again, because I do think, as you said, that this book is for comrades, but it is maybe also for anyone whose affective state when they wake up in the morning involves both, I want to do something, but also I feel beaten down. I feel exhausted.
Yes.
I feel burned out. I can't go on, I'll go on. Right. So I think there's a much wider set of people to whom the idea of psychic militancy, like in the way that you define it really precisely, that they could find a lot of resources in it. People who would not necessarily think of themselves as militants, but people who certainly would think of themselves as working towards a better world, or even just trying, again, getting up in the morning to be like, how do I even conjure that kind of headspace, that sort of will, let alone willfulness, such that I can be agential. And so before I just tossed so many questions at you, but I do want to read, especially for our listeners who are really within the psychoanalytic fold and are probably very interested in the ways that you are doing making a really technical intervention in Freud's idea of the compulsion to repeat. I want them to hear this in your own words. So Lara writes, seizing and retooling the compulsion to repeat reminds us that in the face of power's repetition, we must learn to repeat as well, not in a foreclosed loop of stuckness, but rather as a generative practice of psychic militancy that at every turn challenges and antagonizes power's ability to settle within us. We must repeat for ourselves to remain grounded in material reality and obstruct the nefarious intent of psychic intrusions to derail our revolutionary commitments.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that passage. I was like, yeah, that's it. We do need to repeat. That's why we need to repeat. Let me say just a couple of things. I think this is it ties into despecialization of what does it mean to take theories that were fixed in place or appear to be fixed in place and then understand them as potentially having generative qualities to them. But to do that, I think we read it within the context of how this came to be an actual tool for power. So if we think about the compulsion to repeat, right, the sort of the reach to theoretically read it as a displacement or as a repressive process or that it will fix you in place, to me, is also a tool of power that tells you you are destined to stay here. What does it mean when we read it that it's if people repeat, it's because the conditions that they have to suffer are themselves the conditions that repeat because power constructs it that way, that violence is what repeats. Now, when we start there, that is like the precondition, is starting with liberation and telling the truth and saying structures follow a similar logic. Structures of power and violence follow a similar logic. If you find yourself stuck, it's because the conditions around you are meant to make you feel stuck such that you can't even imagine living in a world that looks differently, right? So that's number one, is that's the seizing of the repetition compulsion. Number two is to go back, Patrick earlier was saying, like in these spaces, these psychoanalysts should know better, these people in these, that tells us something. The predictable nature in which these oppressive structure, in this gets to your question, Abby, about like, what have I seen structurally or in these spaces, is they always fall along the same fault lines. They always break down along the same fault line. So can we be interested in that repetition and then say that repetition has no shame in terms of repeating itself? It shows up every single time. In my case, let's say from the American Psychoanalytic Association, where this quote unquote massive liberal comes out with an email saying that a liberal left has taken over psychoanalysis. And I'm the cult leader of that in some ways. I'm just like, this is not a new story. I could individualize that and be like, that is an attack against me. And certainly there is me involved in that. But if we actually read it, and if we read process and if we read structure and a logic that repeats itself, we can understand that as anything that disrupts a social order is one that is going to be read as this intrusive force, when it's just like, actually, your violence is what is that? Right? So in the face of violence, what I'm kind of trying to say is that there are no platitudes. We sometimes feel like, how is it that I'm still here? Why do I have to still repeat this? If I talk about race, if I talk about gender, if I can talk about patriarchy, I'm the one that's disrupting this like little love fest here. And I'm the killjoy, to go back to Sarah Ahmad. And people love the concept of feminist killjoy, but boy, is it fucking hard to lean into because people don't like it. No, when you disrupt the good time.
Sure do not. Yeah.
They do not. And it can range anywhere from like, we don't like you, mean girl style, to like actually endangering you, depending on what they think is being threatened. That tells us something about the repetitious force we need to engage in. And my entreaty to people is, they're in the face of fascism. There is nothing small enough for us to repeat. Because that repetition is also a way that we tether ourselves to exactly what is happening. So if we take this idea of psychic intrusions are meant to intrude upon our space and scramble our ability to see things, that repetition is as much for us as it is to our commitments to the world. That's why I choose the examples that I choose, from Malcolm X to Leanne Simpson saying, what if nobody sided with colonialism? And like, that is a provocation, because that means at every moment we have to ask, is this me siding with colonialism? And what does it mean if I don't? To Hassan Kanafani and his brilliant interview with Richard Carlton, in which he repeats and repeats and repeats. And until I sort of came to cohere this idea of psychic militancy, I didn't understand fully what he was doing. This repetition and coming back in the face of expectations and legibility in the eyes of the oppressor, where oftentimes what we actually end up doing is softening our message because we think there's a way to become known to these people that might shift something. Maybe we do that unconsciously, sometimes very consciously. And what Hassan Kanafani does in that beautiful interview is prove to us, like, it doesn't matter how I present myself, because this guy already thinks of me as a, brute militant intruder. So then the repetition becomes for us, for our movements, for our political commitments, for our comrades on the ground, to prove that we will not disidentify, but instead actually re-entrench our identifications with those people who are fighting the fight on the front lines, no matter what that looks like, whether that's resistance in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba, right? Or here in the settler colony against ICE death squads. The repetition is as much for us as it is for them. And where I end in the postscript, it's also to put power on alert. Every time we repeat in the face of power, I see what the fuck you're doing. I see that this is something that's happening. I know my psyche's contested space. It's also a moment of antagonism that we force them to show their hand. If nothing else, they're not going to be allowed to do the things they do with the innocence that they rely on, because that's the centerpiece of power.
That interview is incredible, and your reading of it in terms of like his just sort of unyielding repetition. What just occurred to me is, I feel like there's this sort of well-worn psychoanalytic saw that the symptom is a compromise. Right. So like, you can get like Zizek in about or whatever and be like, enjoy your symptom. Right. There's some sort of pleasure in it. But I think you're actually reversing it and saying like the compromise is a symptom.
Absolutely.
Right? Of having
and there's a
yielded
political
to power.
Project to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. And that's the repetition. I think we see this, like the weaponization of theory. That's a repetition. The closing of ranks, like whiteness closes ranks. Avdisa Katupulu talks about this, expelling dissidents, the active political project of the depoliticization of the theory and practice of psychoanalysis under civilizational discourse. That's a repetition. So like the repetition, like you said, goes from like the individual reproduction of a social order that we do clinically, that we do in training. When I was part of training clinicians, I know this firsthand about what you're supposed to teach them, about what it is to be a competent therapist, right? That political compromise is part of the repetition. And so for me, I'm just like, oh, we need a counterforce just as ferocious, if not more, right? And not to be surprised and not to be despairing when we're like, here I am again today repeating this. Like, yeah, you are. You know why? Because capitalism hasn't come undone yet. Because settler colonialism still exists. Because cis heteropatriarchy is still down our fucking throats. That's how far we have to repeat.
Lara, I feel like we could keep talking about this book for so long. It is really remarkable. I want to recommend it to all of our listeners, regardless of whether they are clinicians. I think people will find, I think different readers will find really different things in it to center, but I think all of our listeners will find something really important in it. This episode is coming out just a few days after the book's release. So before we go, I was hoping you might tell us about any book events or appearances that you might want to share with our audience. And also, if you might want to say a few words about your own podcast, Psychic Militancy, which I think will also be of interest to many of our listeners.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's telling that I have chosen Psychic Militancy as a podcast title. But part of that is maybe just the last thing is like to go back to counterinsurgency manuals are very clear about the fact that militants can't change their mind. It's very hard to change the militant's mind. So what you do is you make everybody doubt them. You create them as, as interlopers into their own community. You make people believe that if they were gone, the ills of society would be gone as well. That's why I wanted to do Psychic Militancy as a podcast to say, let's have these public-facing conversations about the ways this stuff works. When stuff is happening in the world, and by stuff, I mean the horrors of violence that we're seeing, can we come together and practice what it means to struggle together to remain focused? Because we know that this is what violence does, is pull us away. So that is what I hoped for with Psychic Militancy. It has long form interviews with folks, but we do a lot of live streams as well that respond to like current day events. And that is really to commit to this. When I wrote this book, it wasn't about just keeping it theoretical. And I really appreciate that you keep saying this is theoretical and praxis oriented. It also is implicating myself and ourselves as those of us who commit to this, to like practice this outwardly, because doing this shit in secret and behind closed doors is precisely what does the work of empire and settler colonialism, to make us think that we're atomized and alone and nobody else is doing this, and that we are smaller as a group than we actually are. I want folks to remember we are the global majority. And I don't mean this lightly, particularly when it comes to issues of Palestine and justice and self-determination. We are a global majority, but this is the way power works, is to make us think that somehow we're fringe. We're not, right? So that's what the podcast hopes to do, is eke out a little space where people can like fall into these conversations that are already happening. I have a mini Northeastern tour in the context of the settler colony of the United States. Before that, May 26th, I'll be in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University doing a book talk with the incredible Maya Wind and Jasper Puar as interlocutors. Hopefully June 20th, Wooden Shoe in Philly. June 21st, I'll be in Brooklyn. June 24th, I'll be in People's Forum in Manhattan. June 25th, I'll be at the Hub in New Jersey. June 26th, Busboys and Poets in DC. And June 27th, Red Emma's in Baltimore, Maryland, which is a favorite place of mine where my heart lives.
Red Emma's and Wooden Shoe. Got a great...
It's my little anarchist heart I'm telling on myself.
Well, thank you so much,
Truly.
Lara.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been so wonderful.
I really, really appreciate it. And I appreciate you making the space.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Lara Sheehi. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.